Hey everybody, this is Brad Dyke saying hi. I'm reaching out to you to talk about more of my experiences with Linux and versus that of Microsoft OSs and of course Unix environments. So the reason why I am continuing this, I call it a 2.2 version of my first one, is that there is a growing sense of, how would you say, um, placement of day-to-day functionality that what we call the end user wants to see, opposed to the nature of what advanced users would deal with. Two totally different aspects. So with that being said, I'll declare what I know. I know pretty much all of the versions of Microsoft, from servers to data center to Windows environments. I also know Unix, worked with that quite extensively. I also have a lot of what we call tier administration Linux experience, where I deal with services or configurations or things like that on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, I have not taken the time to use it as my personal operating system for my day-to-day and so on until I said, okay, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to put my lessons learned with that into the equation so that we would have a good feel for, what is it like. So let's go over that real quick. Okay, so what we're seeing here right now is my Linux operating system. I am on current release version Mint 20.3 on my kernel level, which is 5.15, which is general generic state for my dual Xeon workstation. I have a dual Xeon with 48 gigs of RAM and multiple terabytes of capacity. And in general, it's just a functional isolated box that I work with in regards to the operating environment. Now with this, I also have brought in standard tools, Microsoft Office variation, which is known as LibreOffice, and that version is, as you can see here. And what my goal here was to just kind of act like a basic user. Track when I had to go into advanced user mode and come back into that equation to decipher, to address, and so on, what I want to do here. And so the challenge was, how often do I have to step out of being just a guy who needs to execute, do, handle, browse, banking, things like that, versus learning outside of what would be the norm of a Microsoft Office environment or a Microsoft Windows environment, and tracking those. So here's my result. So the result is that I came on board with the Linux operating system as an end user, and I give it a score of 100 to 1. 100 being the best, better than Microsoft Windows version 11. And of course, also the other components of appearance, feel, difficulty, and process. So when I installed Windows 11 on this exact system on an alternate NVMe drive setup, I got X, Y, and Z, pretty much exactly what I expected with some caveat changes, but I could right click, I could get to my point. Even if I had to relearn it a little bit, I could get to my point and get to the tools that I needed and continue to function, to use whatever, Visio, Office, whatever, Outlook, and so on. The process for that was roughly a scale of about 82%. So out of 100, I give it an 82. Now, I like Linux for its ability to be clean from the start, and then you add what you want. It's a very good security feature. It also has a double effect, and that is it's very nuisance of a feature because pretty much most of your stuff is secure, and if you're going to do anything, you're going to have to make it unsecure and then resecure it correctly with the proper credentials and so on, so those services or functions are there for you. This is something that Microsoft Windows doesn't do. Windows makes it available up front and then says you secure it. It's kind of in reverse, mostly because of ease of function and access. Now, with that being said, On top of that process, you also have what we call the interactive. In other words, your skill to get to what you want to do. Not so great, unfortunately. You really do have to sit down and take some time. The biggest Achilles heel of Linux is the fact of the old version information is out there. So you really have to change your mindset in regards to going out on Google and Googling it, because there's a really good chance that 80% of whatever you read is wrong, because of the fact that they're for an older version of the Linux release. And there's not that clarity of the versions unless you go several levels high and do the additional research. The key detail about working specifically with Mint is that you need to clearly identify your reb of your operating system, any patches, your kernel information, and then ask the question what you want. You'll get a lot better result, a 50-50 kind of mindset. And then you have to experiment and play and learn. This means you have to be the advanced user. That's a ding against Mint. It's not a bad ding, it's just your reality. And so when you come into the reality of Mint, which of all the Linux operating environments I've worked with, Ubuntu and Pop and several of the others, SUSE and BSD, I find that Mint is probably the best out there. And then I use the Plasma KDE interface on top of that, just for clarification, so you know what my desktop looks like, and that, what am I overlapping with those. Now, that's the second component. If I gave a scale of 1 to 100 for Mint 20.3, I would give it a 72. Yeah, 10% less than that of Windows 11. There are a couple of reasons why. Mint itself as KDE is okay. It's the graphical interface is good, and it's consistent. That's great. It's exactly the same as Windows 11. But when you bring in a KDE like Plasma, it's an overlay. It sits on top of the operating system itself. And one way you can know this is to realize that when you go to your operating system and you bring up your leave command, which is down here on the lower section, and you go to restart, you're going to go to a second restart page. And this is the true Mint session. And with that, this is really an overlap. In other words, you have to do it twice. In some cases, in other tools, the same thing, the same situation is in play. So it's very important that you understand that with Plasma KDE, it's just an overlay to give you this look that you see here, and some of the functionality tools which make things a little cleaner, a little easier, a little more functional, kind of like Windows 11, but not, because you don't have the capacity of Windows 11 in this environment. You just have an overlay. So with that being said, the second part of this, Mint is a 72 on my grade scale, Windows 11 an 82. I'm sticking with Mint. I'm going to go to Mint 21, possibly maybe Mint 22, and I'm testing the transition stage, similar to how Windows 10 goes to Windows 11. Just because you've got a new piece of software doesn't necessarily mean you need to go to that latest code, because it could be literally bleeding edge. Take your time, do the research before you step your code up. The same thing with the kernel. Make sure that when you do your kernel update, which is not part of your normal Windows update, it's important that you understand what you're dealing with so that you can transition to newer software safely. Now, the last part is the applications. I have to admit, Linux has got a greater spectrum of functionality because of the open source, but the terminology, the naming, and everything in between those two values is kind of frustrating. Zippo does not mean Zippo. It means that it's a compressionary GUI tool for gzip or something like that, opposed to terms like WinZip and partition magic, and just all the terminologies that you're familiar with execution-wise for Windows or Microsoft environments, or even SCO Unix, if you're that old school, or Solaris Unix, again, another different type of old school. The verbiages of Linux are not the same as the verbiages of Microsoft and Unix. And that it's really important that when you do reach out to start the process of researching good applications, take the time to understand that you really should look for those best tools for your version of Linux. That's very important, because if you take that time and you learn that you need to say Mint 20.3 top 10 applications for disk partition or something along like that path, or you want to do a graphical user manager interface for gzip, which is the equivalency of WinZip for Microsoft, or Arch, or other tools like that. The end result is by putting the operating system environment in there first, you're going to get a better result. If you just simply type in Linux application tool, blah, 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 top 10, BSD doesn't work the same as Ubuntu and SUSE and so on and so on. So optimized code for optimized Linux operating systems is an important detail, and you get weird effects if you don't take the time to do the R&D. If you hear the common thread here, the common thread is bring your operating system title into the equation, then put in your search. You're going to get a better result. So with that approach, I give literally 120% to Linux, where Microsoft is more of a 70%, because Microsoft tries too desperately to control everything so it fits well within their confinement. You don't need that if you have a CLI environment. You just need to be compliant with the protocols. And as I've said in the past, you learn the top 42 protocols. You learn all the vendors in the industry, because they all have to work to the protocols of IT. So with that being said, I'm sticking with Mint for now. I give Mint a thumbs up. The reasons are justified, because when I ask the question, when Microsoft becomes too expensive, could I take the denominational offices of my church denomination to a Linux environment and get them back to focusing strictly on ministry only, with a little bit of the same equivalency of supporting Microsoft? Can I do the same thing at Linux? And genuinely, I have to say, it's coming. Linux is not there yet. It's getting there. Streamlining, closing, more secured nature approach, and so on, has got to happen, because it doesn't always pan out right because of too many independents in the equation. In other words, coders go out there and they do stuff, and then they kind of bring it into the equation that it would work in the operating system. In Microsoft standards, to credit to them, they set the standard so that you would write the code to that standard first. Kind of a reverse effect. But creativity is just that. It's creativity. Don't ever lose hope and function in your ability, because if you do, then I tell you that you put yourself in a box. Linux really does give you a lot of flexibility. But with that being said, I'm going to continue doing these evaluations and seeing, can Linux truly be an office level OA deployed OS for the common Joe Blow? And I think that probably Mint is one of the few that actually can probably get there if they stay on the same roadmap they're on now. For this, I give a thumbs up for Mint. My next Mint review will be when I step up to the probably Mint 22, and I will evaluate the upgrade process. Made one attempt earlier and it failed. And it was relationship to the nature of the drive itself. So hopefully they'll fix that problem and we'll try it again. This is Brad Dyke signing off. You guys take care, and God bless.